Good morning. Families, right? We're all part of one in some way. When I was growing up, my primary identities were brother and son. Recently, I got married, so now I also have the role of husband. I don't have any kids yet, but I do have a dog. For Father's Day last year, my wife bought me a shirt. It has a little dog with a Darth Vader helmet on it. It says, "Dog, I am your father." Yep, we're those people. It's been about a year since I've been married, and Kristen has actually seen very few pictures of me when I was a kid. And not for lack of trying, she kept asking me to show her some, but I just kind of strategically dodged that request. So she circumvented me and went straight to my mother, who, of course, happily provided her with the photo album. So last week, we're sitting there Easter Sunday, and she's going through these pictures of me when I was younger. And she said, "This is an awkward experience, just looking at yourself when you're younger. You kind of want to forget that those things ever happened, but your family knows that they happened. They were there. They saw it. They saw you when you were younger and goofy. They see you as you are today. They've seen all of it." We're going to talk about families today. It's in our world, families are an important thing, and really, mainstream media has caught on to that. That's why a lot of the television shows that you see feature families, because they know that if they put a family on television, you immediately relate to some part of it, because you have a family too. And so there's a lot of shows that have been throughout the decades dealing with families. Some that showed families that were nearly perfect, the dad who always just seemed to know exactly the right thing to say at different times. Others who showed families that were markedly imperfect. Recently, Kristen and I have begun into a couple shows that just showed up. One's called Speechless, the other's called American Housewife. It has nothing to do with Real Housewives of the OC, completely different show. But both of them are shows that have these families that sort of have the odds stacked against them. They have some challenges they have to overcome, but they do it as a family, and it's kind of fun to watch. Recently, however, another show has shown up that's kind of hit a rough spot for a lot of people. It's made the news, really, just because of how popular it became, and that's the show This Is Us. If you've seen the show, you know that it tends to touch a nerve, because it really just gets a little bit too close to home. In fact, if you've seen it, don't tell me what happens, because I'm only about 8 episodes in. Kristen and I had to stop watching it. We were tired of crying. That's just kind of where this show left us. And I'll tell you why. The show, what it does that I haven't seen done nearly this well before, is it takes you through 2 different timelines. One in which you have this mom and dad about 25 years ago raising their kids. And then it jumps you 25 years in the future or so to where these kids are adults, and you see the consequences of what happened when these parents tried to be there for their kids. Now, the thing is, these parents were really, by all accounts, pretty good parents. And they were imperfect, and the show shows their imperfections, but they tried so hard. And they loved their kids so much. But the little flaws, the little things that they got wrong, things that just by themselves wouldn't seem like they're that big of a deal, 25 years later, defined the lives of their kids. That just hurts. Because there's pressure there, right? As families, we know that the people that we're closest to, we have an impact on their lives, and they have an impact on ours. And sometimes that impact doesn't go the way that we wanted it to. And even in our best intentions, things go wrong. And yet we also know how much joy we've seen in families too. And different people have different experiences with this. So we're going to talk about families for the next 4 weeks. Some of you, when I say we're going to talk about families for the next 4 weeks, are extremely excited about that. You're excited about that because inside you are screaming, "Help me!" Because you've got a family, you've got kids or grandkids or something like that, and you know that you need some help. Now, I've got some good news for you here. At Rose Drive, we actually have an incredible family ministries system going on. We have incredible children's ministry staff and workers, a great junior high ministry, a high school ministry. You just saw evidence of what our high schoolers are up to just a moment ago. Yeah, you can clap for them. That's fine. That's good. I love you guys. Yeah, I miss hanging out with you guys. It's been a little while. It's been fun. So different people have jumped in on those ministries. But also, we have a family ministries pastor. His name is Jason Moronis, and you'll actually get to hear from him later in this series. And he's really been helping us to connect families to the idea of how can we equip our families to better show the love of God to each other. And so that's what we're doing. So you're in a good place for that. So there's some really great things happening. But I also know that when I say that we're going to do a series on family for the next 4 weeks, that a lot of you are actually kind of afraid of that. Or at minimum, you've put up a wall. There's defenses going up, shields. Because rightly so, you're probably a little bit concerned about what I'm going to say about family. Am I going to tell you that your family needs to look a certain way or make you feel sort of guilt for how your family has shown up? And those things are all legitimate concerns because those things have happened even in the church. And I'm aware of that. It wasn't that long ago that I was a single adult in his late 20s, right? And when you're a single adult in your late 20s, here's what tends to happen. People just kind of assume that you should be married by then. Now, it doesn't matter that the average marriage age for girls now is 26 and for guys is 28. That didn't matter. What seems to happen, though, is as you get older, people want to know, when are you finally going to settle down? When are you finally going to get a wife? I've been told that advice so many times. Like, you should just go out and get married. Like, okay, I'm just going to head to the store and buy a wife now. Like, it just happens all the time, right? And if you're a single adult, you've felt this, I'm sure. So one of the worst things that could possibly happen to me, and this happened a lot, is people would hand me some kind of slip where they wanted to know more about me. If I was speaking to something or I was applying for something, they would ask the question, tell me about your family. I hated that question so much. And it had nothing to do with my parents and my sister. I love my parents. They were great. And my sister is awesome. We have a great relationship, and I'm so proud of her. I am not in any way ashamed of my family at all. But when I looked at that question as a single adult in my late 20s, I know that they're not asking about my parents. They want to know if I'm married, do I have kids, that's what all is. So then I got this blank here, and so what, do I write none? Do I talk about my parents? Do I talk about the friends I was living life with that in many ways served as a sort of family at the time? I didn't know. It was an awkward question. I had no way of figuring out how to answer this. And so I get that. So when you talk about family, depending on where you are in life, it could be awkward. How is a single adult supposed to figure out what family means to them? How are you supposed to figure out what family means if you were a child who had a parent walk out on you? How are you supposed to figure out what family means if you're a parent or a grandparent who has kids that just aren't talking to you anymore? How are you supposed to figure out what family means if you really gave it all that you had, but divorce happened anyway? When these things occur, when families get messy, the whole concept of families gets a little bit confusing and, quite honestly, very painful. So I recognize what's probably going to happen this morning and possibly the rest of this series is that I'm going to be playing a game of Operation. Have you ever played Operation? It's a little game where there's this guy on a fake operating table. He has these little metal tweezers, and if you just barely miss and touch the sides, then the thing goes off. And he has like a Rudolph nose, and so that thing lights up bright red. I don't know why you're operating on the rest of him. He has a Rudolph nose. Take care of that first. Like that's a problem. But when we're talking about families, there's certain landmines that inevitably I'm going to step on. And I'll try to call some of those out as we go. But here's what I would ask this morning, is let's take a look at the big idea of what God is hoping for from families. And I know that sometimes what God intended for families and what we see in Scripture doesn't always match up with your lived experience. And so sometimes it's just a little bit hard to wrestle with. But let's try and see what God's intent was, and maybe even a little bit how that played out. I think we're going to find that as we talk about it, the idea of families is very important. But how families have shown up for us, well, God's in that too. So I'm going to talk about three different things that when I look at Scripture, I see as generally being true about families. And here's the first thing I want you to know. That when you look at Scripture, it's pretty clear that you were not meant to live alone. We are social creatures. We're meant to live in community with other people. And one of the most natural expressions of that is our biological families. That's kind of the first community that we grow up into for most of us. And so that becomes an important piece. And it was there since the beginning of the Bible. And so when you look in Genesis, you see sort of the formation of that. So in Genesis chapter 2, it says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" So God tried many different things that might help man find companionship. In the end, the only thing that was suitable was other humans. That humans are the only thing that helps us as social creatures. Now, talked about landmines. I recognize that in this verse, there are landmine problems. And there's been a lot of the issues of, okay, so were women created to be subservient to men? All that is there. I want to acknowledge that landmine and completely skip over it today. Because that is not my intent. What I do want you to see is that people are created to be in community with other people. Okay, Going to jump onto the landmine. Here we go. Genesis 24. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh, right? And so there's this idea that community is important. There's a commitment to it. There's something that's very bonding about that. Now, once again, the landmine here. I am not suggesting that marriage is ultimately the only way that community is expressed. Like I said before, that's particularly difficult when people basically imply you need to go to a store to buy a wife. Like that's not the thing. What I want you to see here is this importance that God has placed on families and how it's built into the DNA of our humans' fabric, like the fabric of our society. This is what God has been building from the beginning. Now, marriage is a very normal and natural part of that, but it's not the only part of that. And there's an author in the New Testament who frequently talks about the value of people who aren't married but have different kinds of meaningful relationships with people as well. All of that really points to this basic idea that we just talked about. We were not meant to live life alone. We are not meant to go at life alone. We're meant to be tied into it with other people. And so families may look very different for us. Each of us has a different understanding of what that means. But all of us are tied to people, and that's how it's supposed to be. And while it has many challenges and many hurts, there's also many joys that we can experience from that. Last month, my grandfather passed away. His health had been declining for a while, but still the events surrounding him actually passing were rather sudden. And so my family kind of had to spring into action, and we had to figure out, the kinds of things you have to figure out when someone in your family passes. It was particularly hard on my mom because it was her dad that passed, and so we were trying to figure out how to support her and all that. And so Kristen, my wife, said we need to just get her something to show her that we're in this with her. We can't make the hurt go away, but we want to be in it with her. And so we went to, of all places, the Hallmark store. I'm a little apprehensive about Hallmark, partly about this conviction that they have taken way too much of my money over the holiday seasons. We're in this store. I can't find anything that's helpful, but Kristen comes across something that was actually very helpful. It was this little picture here it's got this tree on it. It's kind of artistically done with little birds and stuff. And I know you can't read what's there at the bottom, but at the bottom it says this: God gave us family so we'd never forget what love feels like. Oh, Hallmark, you got me. That's just cruel. Ugh. And so we got it, and we gave it to my mom. It's just an expression that we are in this together. That's the kind of thing that families can experience. That we can be in it with each other, that we can experience life together, and through that, we can provide joy for each other, even in the trying times, because we were not meant to live life alone. And families, they held so much promise, they still do. But something else happened. We call it sin. And in our broken world, we know that families are not perfect. Sin came into this world and polluted a lot of things. Our families are one of the casualties. And so there isn't one of us sitting in this room who hasn't had some hurt or pain or trust broken in our families, because sin is there and it permeates our world. And so here's what I want you to understand. The Bible does not paint a picture of a perfect family. You don't see that in the Bible. In fact, really, when you start to look at the stories, and particularly in the Old Testament, you look at the families who are there, they're families who were stuck in the mess that sin creates. And so the families that you see in the Bible, even the ones that have people in it that we call heroes of the faith, are oftentimes really, really messed up. And just to prove that, Jason Moronos, our family ministries pastor, he turned me onto this list here of a couple families that are in the Old Testament. And I'm going to warn you right now, this is not PG. So if you've got a young one next to you, you might want to earmuffs. This is out of the Bible. The first recorded husband and wife calamitously disobey God. Their firstborn murders his own brother. Sarah's grief over infertility moves her to give her servant Hagar to have sex with her husband Abraham. When it happens, Sarah abuses Hagar in jealous anger, and Abraham is passive in the whole thing. Lot is reluctant to leave Sodom, but is dragged out by angels and weeks later seduced by his own daughters. Isaac and Rebekah play favorites with their twin boys, creating one of the biggest sibling rivalries of all time. Jacob manipulates and deceives his brother out of his birthright. This one's fun. Jacob's uncle Laban, when he was supposed to be married to Rachel, managed to switch the girls on the wedding night. And so Jacob ends up marrying the two sisters, which creates another sibling feud because they spend the rest of their lives arguing over who could essentially give Jacob better children. Jacob's daughter Dinah is raped by the pagan Shechem, who wants to marry her. So her brothers Simeon and Levi not only murder him, but also all the men in Shechem's town. Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, can't really keep his desires in check, ends up sleeping with his brother's mother. Judah, a widower who frequented prostitutes, this occurred frequently enough that his daughter-in-law Tamar, whom he had dishonored, knew that if she disguised herself as a prostitute, he'd sleep with her. He did and got her pregnant. This is just Genesis. The families we see in the Bible are not perfect. They can't be. They live in the same broken world that we do, right? Sin permeated their lives. Families aren't perfect. But what we do see in the Bible is that families are the people that we enter the mess of life with. Family is who we enter the mess of life with, and all of its imperfections, and all of the chaos. Family is who we go to when things get confusing, things get tricky. And even if our relationships are struggling, they're the people that we come back to because they're the ones who have committed to us. Now, the Bible has lots of examples, more examples of broken families than good ones. But there is one example of a family that I think mostly got it right in the Bible. And I do want to hit that one before we leave this place today, and that's the story of Ruth. If you know the story of Ruth, you know that there's an active family there. In Ruth chapter 1, you get the backstory of what's happening. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Kilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, so in the first 5 verses of Ruth, we have a higher body count than the first 5 minutes of most Disney movies. There's 6 characters introduced, 3 girls, 3 guys. All the guys are deceased by the end of the first 5 verses. Naomi is now left with her 2 daughters-in-law. They aren't related to her biologically. They aren't her own kids. They have a relationship after all that time they spent in a foreign land together. But really, these women don't owe Naomi anything. Naomi isn't their mother. They have a life that they continue to live in Moab. And so then, when a crisis hits and a change needs to be made, what are they going to do? In verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. Naomi came to the realization that she needed to go back home. And she also came to the realization that her daughters-in-law probably needed to stay where they were. They had never been back there before. They grew up in Moab. That was their home. And so to ask the daughters-in-law to go with her, actually, that was going to be a problem. They would go to this land where they didn't know anyone. Their prospects of finding a future husband were low. And so really the best thing Naomi could do for her daughters-in-law is to release them and say, "Go stay in your land." Now, we're going to skip over a couple verses of protest. Both daughters-in-law protest, but ultimately Orpah's going to decide to take up Naomi's offer and to stay back. At this time, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." This is family. Family is a concept that's sometimes hard to get our heads around just because of how much brokenness there is in our world. But when it shows up, when it comes into play, it changes everything. The first thing I told you this morning was that we as people were not meant to live alone. And we see that in the Genesis story, that we are not meant to live alone. And then the second thing that we identified was that family is who we enter the mess of life with. But there's one more thing that's pretty significant about the way that families work, and it's this. Family works when you are willing to live for something besides yourself. Now, that's what Ruth decided to do in her story with Naomi. She was going to live for something just besides herself. And this is how families function. And sometimes the people who are going to commit to you and willing to invest in you and do life with you aren't even people who you're biologically related to. My wife, Kristen, has some people from her life who really have fulfilled roles of family. She calls them adoptive parents, adoptive grandparents. And when we got married last year, many of them were right there along with her biological family, helping walk her down the aisle, because these were people who had committed parts of their lives to her. And they were as much family as anyone. Because of that. You probably felt it at some point. The deepest hurts in families occur when someone violates this covenant. When someone in your family decides that they're going to look out for themselves first and family gets put to the side. Or maybe you're aware of a way that you've done this. That we've done this at some point where we've taken our own interests and put them ahead of our families. In the process, our family got hurt or put to the side. Now, more often than not, we're very aware when another family member has done this and has hurt us. We're oftentimes less aware when we've failed at this. But that's where families, where real pain starts to seep in, where our experience of our families turns from positive to negative. And this is going to happen in our broken world. I wish I could tell you it wasn't, but it's going to. But as Christians who've experienced the love of Christ, we know that for ourselves, we've been charged with the task of demonstrating God's love. First and foremost, we love God. That is our biggest calling. But the next thing is to love those people that are in life with us, the people that we are committed to, the people that we would identify as family, whatever form that family may take. And third, we're called to love all people, but hopefully when you're loving others and you're loving all people in this world, you're doing it with your family. That together, you're demonstrating what the love of Christ is like. And yes, this breaks down, but it's so beautiful when you get that glimmer of God's love shown through families. And it reminds me that this thing is true. God gave us families so that we never forget what love feels like. It's an incredible thing. So why are we going to talk about families for the next 4 weeks? Well, there's really two reasons. One is this. We all need help. Each and every one of us. If you have kids, you know that you need help. But even if you don't, wherever we find ourselves, whatever role we are, a sibling, a son, a daughter, a parent, a grandparent, a cousin, someone who's related to someone else in some other way. Maybe your relationship with people, it's still family, but we don't have a good term for it. Whatever the situation is, we need help. We need help when things get rough, and we're going to talk about restoration in this series. We need help encouraging each other to follow Christ more faithfully, and we're going to talk about that in this series. And this church, God's people, are family to each other, and we're going to talk about that too. But there's another reason that we need to talk about that, and it's this. In our culture, we are very much focused on the individual. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Cultures tend to kind of swing one direction or the other. There's some cultures that focus so much on family that you get what's sort of a shame culture, as in, if you do something, your primary lens is, will this bring shame to my family? And as an individual, that could be very stressful, because you can end up bringing shame into that equation. So those extremely tight-knit scenarios kind of make it so that you almost don't have an individual identity. Your identity is wrapped up in that of your family. But that's not our problem in our culture. We're very much the other way on the pendulum. Our culture idolizes the individual and what I want, what makes me feel good, what feels right to me, even if it hurts my family in the process. That's the narrative that we see a little bit more often. And I'm going to tell you that that's just as damaging, because our identity is very much informed by our family, whatever shape that might take for you. I want to show you sort of a slightly obscure passage in Mark. It's something we don't talk about too often, but it's kind of important, I think. Jesus is going to be in a situation that's talking about one thing, but we're going to get to another in just a minute. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" And that's something that was happening. They had these cleansing rituals, and the disciples weren't following that, so it was rubbing the Pharisees the wrong way. He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rituals.' You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And this was the problem that the Pharisees were constantly dealing with. They had all these traditions, these religious rules that they were supposed to follow, and in the process ended up not doing what was most important, loving God and loving others. So Jesus is going to drop the hand-washing thing for a minute. He's not actually concerned about that. He's going to show them just how bad things had gotten for them with this kind of unusual passage that takes just a little bit of unpacking. So look at this. And Jesus continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that which might have been used to help their father and mother is Corban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother." This is the part that takes some unpacking because Corban isn't a familiar process to us. But this is something that I see over there, Corban. It's not a name. This is a concept. Corban, the concept, is this. If you earmarked some of your possessions to give to the temple after death, then those possessions could essentially be used however you want so long as you're still alive. So people had this sort of loophole option that really the temple system gave them, which was if I didn't want to actually care for my parents or other family members, if I wanted to keep my stuff to myself and not have to worry about an ethical obligation to them, I can earmark all of my stuff for the temple system afterwards, and then I am no longer ethically responsible for helping out my family. I mean, this goes back to Jesus' time. There were people who were trying to get out of the responsibility that they had to their family, and this still happens in our time. We don't necessarily have to go through a loophole quite this elaborate, but that's exactly what we do. Sometimes in our lives, we end up forgetting that our family is something that we're committed to, something that we belong to, something that is there to show us what God's love is like. And so here's all I want you to do today. We're going to be jumping into the rest of this series. I encourage you to come back for the next 3 weeks. It's going to be a lot of fun. But today, all I want you to do is this. I want you to give your family a hug. That's it. Go hug your family. That little guy there? This guy? That's the hug emoji. You might not know that, but that's what that's supposed to be. It looks like jazz hands. I don't know, but that's the hug emoji. If your family is not within hugging distance, send them that. Let your family, whatever you consider to be your family, know how much you care about them. Know how important they are to you. Let them know that you are committed to them through whatever mess life brings. I just want to leave you with one last thought. It's this. I know that sometimes the church is given the impression that when you walk through the doors, you're supposed to come in as a perfect person with a perfect family. I know we've sometimes given that impression. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, you know that's a horrible lie. Because no one in this room is perfect or has a perfect family. That was never the design. We don't have families to achieve perfection. We have families precisely because life is messy. And in this church, we've got all sorts of messy families. I just want to tell you that I'm glad that yours is here. Whatever your life is like, whether you have family in this room or not, whether your family makes you proud or sometimes you'd wish that they do different things in their lives, whatever your family looks like, however it happened, you're welcome here. We're a messy people in a messy life. But hey, this is us. God, today, we recognize that your plan for families is amazing. that it has so much promise and can bring so much joy, and yet there's also so much brokenness. And God, we give all that to you today. God, we give you our fears, our questions, the challenges that we have with family, but then we also, God, give you the joys that we receive. We say, God, help us to be a people who are committed to family, whatever that looks like, however that's shown up for us. And may we see our family as your blessing to us, as just one illustration of the love that you have for us. In your name we pray. Amen.